Welcome to the Reconcilence Review Show. It's horror month, and this year we're covering the Poltergeist franchise. Now last week we reviewed the atrocious 2015 remake. This week we'll be reviewing the superior version, the original 1982 Poltergeist, written and produced by the legendary Steven Spielberg, with assistance from Frank Marshall, Michael Grace, and Mark Victor, based on a story by Spielberg, and directed by Master of Horror, Tobe Hooper, the man behind, in my opinion, the scariest movie in existence, 1974's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now there's been rumors for years from people on set that Spielberg was actually behind the camera more than he let on, but both he and Hooper have consistently denied this. And if you ask me, you can actually see both of their influences in this, and regardless of who did what, it's a classic nonetheless. The film stars Craig T. Nelson and Jo Beth Williams as Steve and Diane Freeling, Oliver Robbins as their son Robbie, and the late Dominique Dunne and the late Heather O'Rourke as daughters Dana and Carol Ann, respectively. The film co-stars Beatrice Straight as Dr. Martha Lesh, Michael McManus and Virginia Kaiser as Mr. and Mrs. Tuttle, Martin Casella as Dr. Marty Casey, Richard Lawson as Dr. Ryan Mitchell, James Karen as Mr. Lewis Teague, Dirk Blocker as Jeff Shaw, Lou Perry as Pugsley, and Zelda Rubinstein as clairvoyant psychic Tangina Barons in supporting roles. With that said, let's get started on our review of 1982's Poltergeist. As the film begins, we hear the national anthem play through the opening credits as it transitions to fuzzy distorted images on the screen for a few seconds, and then the camera slowly zooms out to reveal the source to be a late-night program on the television set. With Steve Freeling passed out on the couch, we see the family dog run upstairs through each bedroom, and for a few moments we experience an average night in this family's life. No dialogue has even been spoken yet, and it says a lot about the direction when you can convey such a lived-in feeling in 3 minutes without a word being said. All we hear is the slowly creeping score from Jerry Goldsmith as youngest daughter Carol Ann, in a hypnotizingly chilling scene, is drawn to the running television set downstairs. The way that the score gradually progresses as we witness a brilliant long shot of Carol Ann slowly hopping down each stair before sitting down in front of the TV is so fucking creepy. With the father still asleep, Carol Ann begins to talk to the TV, and the score transitions into the bone-chilling Carol Ann's theme. And with the additional story elements that are touched upon in the sequel, it makes this retroactively even more unsettling. As she begins to converse with the television as if someone is there, she begins to yell louder to the recipient that she can't hear them, thus awakening the father, the mother, and her 2 siblings to go and see what's going on. What I love about this scene is that it's not erratic, like them rushing to see what's going on, yelling and turning on the lights and stuff. There's none of that. It's just a quiet moment as the father slowly awakes, and he, along with the approaching mother and siblings, seem just as intrigued as Carol Ann is. They don't even say anything to her. They just watch and allow her to continue her conversation. It's so fucking unsettling. We see the television lights flashing across her face as her smile turns half sinister, but in a nuanced and subtle way. God, Heather O'Rourke is so damn good in this. She really sells this whole damn premise. We see one last shot of the bewilderment from the family. End scene, as we cut to a daytime shot over a hillside as Carol Ann's bone-shivering theme plays over a sweeping shot, as we get closer and closer to a suburban neighborhood typical of Spielberg's films. The creepiness seamlessly eases into a more magical invoking portion of the theme, where it swells as we see children riding bikes up and down the street, and just playing outside in general, a la E.T. Jerry Goldsmith really knocked it out of the park with this soundtrack. He perfectly captured both the creepiness of Hooper and the innocence of Spielberg at the same time. Magnificent job, sir. This is how you start a horror movie. We're barely 5 minutes in and we've already set the tone for the entire film. For the next 12 minutes or so, we witness the minutiae of an average day in this family's life. Everything is generally at ease until we get around the 17-minute mark. The tension starts to slowly build in a nighttime scene where Robbie gets scared of the clown doll in his and Carol Ann's room, as well as the creepy-ass tree outside their window. I mean, you can't blame him. What child wouldn't shit themselves under those circumstances? Hell, as an adult, that creepy-ass tree outside the window still makes me fucking uneasy. There's no way I could sleep with that shit in clear view. Now, Spielberg has commented before that as a child, everything around him scared him. particularly at nighttime, so he used this real-life inspiration for this scene and, I'm assuming, others in this film. There's a short scene that follows with the parents smoking a joint in their bedroom that I really enjoyed. They really feel like a married couple, at ease with a ton of history between them, and not like actors in the slightest. Hats off to Nelson and Williams for breathing life into these characters. Carol Ann and Robbie end up sleeping in their parents' room and were treated to a scene similar to the one in the beginning of the film, with Carol Ann and the television airing the same program once again. Only this time, the spirits make contact and seem to open some sort of portal, as Carol Ann says that ever-so-famous line, "They're here." If I were a parent and I woke up to my child saying that shit in front of the TV, I'd be shook as all fucking hell, especially with this being the second time now. Also, I noticed that the time on the clock says 2:37. I wonder if that was a reference to King and Kubrick's The Shining. Nevertheless, the next morning, the parents assumed that the tremors that they felt the night before were due to an earthquake. Now, there was a scene earlier on where Carol Ann's pet bird died and they buried it in the backyard. And as this morning scene commences, we notice some construction workers digging up dirt outside with bulldozers next door, dislodging the box the bird was buried in. I never paid much attention to that before, but it serves as a nice bit of foreshadowing. Later, we see the mother in the kitchen alone as she reaches for something under the sink. As she turns around, there's Carol Ann sitting on the counter before her as that uneasy theme creeps up once again. It's then revealed that all the chairs behind them at the kitchen table are stacked on top of one another in an odd pattern. Now I'd like to take a brief moment to address something. At the end of last week's review of the 2015 Poltergeist remake, I stated that I had a personal story tying into my first viewing of this original version we're discussing today. I'd like to elaborate on that story at this time. Now, when I was a child, I was not down with anything horror-related. My mother and older sister are from Holland, and they used to tell me and my younger sister ghost stories and folk tales from where they grew up in Suriname. I was 7 years old when The Blair Witch came out, 9 when The Ring came out, and 12 when the first Saw came out. I watched them, and I was not intrigued in the slightest. I hated Halloween and never understood how people could celebrate a day of all things morbid and then turn around and do Christmas 2 months later. Anyway, fast forward a few years to October 2008 in Fountain, Colorado. It's roughly a week before Halloween, and one of my best friends and I decided to check out a horror movie, which I was more open to now being 16 years old. So my mom picked us up from school and dropped us off at Applebee's, and afterwards we walked over to the nearby Blockbuster. Or maybe it was Hollywood Video. I can't quite remember. We had both in adjacent lots separated by Burger King, so it could have been either. We start browsing the horror section, trying to decide on something to rent based on the box art. A now non-existent tradition due to fucking Netflix. We see the cover for Poltergeist 1 and 2 side by side, and the box art looked so cool on both that was all we needed. So we rented both. We go back to my house. We have a bottle of Seagram's gin, a couple of bottles of Old English, and an eighth of weed, and Domino's is on the way. We spend close to the next 4 hours watching both installments back to back, and by the time we were done, we just sat there for like 5 minutes in silence reflecting on what we just watched and put ourselves through. Neither of us had ever experienced a psychological horror before up to that point, as we were used to seeing the more gory stuff being advertised while we were kids. So needless to say, this was quite a shock. My best friend didn't even want to walk home to his house, and at the time he lived less than 5 minutes away by foot. So a few hours pass. I'm getting out of the shower, with those films still very much on my mind. I head back to my room to smoke another bowl, settle in and watch an episode of The Nanny before going to bed. A few minutes into the episode, I hear all kinds of fucking noise coming from the kitchen. I open my door just a crack, and I hear a groaning coming from that direction. As I slowly approach, metal bat in hand, the grumbling becomes more of a garbled cluster of incoherent vowels and consonants. As I'm turning the corner around the pantry door, I notice an open box of Cocoa Pebbles spilled out across the floor. The fridge wide open with the contents missing and rearranged. And as I look to the stove on my left, there was my mother, completely out of it. She looked directly at me, with an open can of SpaghettiOs in her hand that she started to heat up in the saucepan, still mumbling incoherently. I was in so much shock that I didn't know what the fuck to do. I attempted to initiate a conversation to try and figure out what was going on, and good God was that a mistake, because the second that I did that, she grabbed the wooden spoon and the hot ass saucepan of SpaghettiOs and started heaping spoonfuls at me and everything around her. Where the hell she got the SpaghettiOs from, I have no clue. I didn't eat them, she didn't eat them. They appeared out of nowhere as far as I was concerned. She then turned around and threw the now empty saucepan directly at the center of the front door. Man, did I haul fucking ass back into my goddamn room and lock the motherfucking door. My father, who was a corrections officer at a youth detention center in Pueblo at the time, wasn't going to be home until close to midnight, and it was barely a little after 9 at this time. Needless to say, I explained what was going on, not really knowing what to say exactly, and about 45 minutes later he showed up with the ambulance and they took her to the hospital. Now I'm still intoxicated from smoking and drinking earlier, and as soon as they left, I hit my fucking laptop and started searching phrases like Poltergeist movie real and Poltergeist movie haunting real life and things of the sort. It didn't help that I came across several articles about the Poltergeist curse. What's that, may you ask? Sounds like fan fiction, you say. Oh, no, not at all. The lore around it may be fictional, but I promise you the events and details absolutely did occur, and every single one of them was a real-life tragedy. But we'll elaborate more on that in 2 weeks when we get to the third film. Anyway, so I'm panicking at the house, and a few hours later my father calls and tells me that my mother had a bad reaction to a new sleep medication that her doctor had put her on. It was her first night on the new regimen, and obviously a change needed to be made, and it sufficiently was. The sigh of relief of having a logical explanation washed over me, but I was still really shook by the whole day's events. I ended up staying home for the next 2 days, and it wasn't until 5 years later in 2013, at the age of 21, that I gave it another shot. And not only did I watch part 1 and 2 again, along with the first time viewing of the third, but I very much began to enjoy the genre as a whole. And before I knew it, I had a growing Blu-ray collection of titles. A Clockwork Orange, Perfect Blue, the early Elm Street and Friday the 13th films, the early Halloween films, and even with TV for years I watched Hannibal, Bates Motel, and the Channel Zero series, the last one being the scariest series I've ever seen, and all 4 seasons are fucking terrifying. But we'll get to that next year. Sorry to deviate from the review and ramble on like that, but it was a true story that has stayed with me for 16 years now, and I feel like if I can contribute something to add to the authenticity of this retrospective, then I should probably do so. With that being said, back to the review. Later that night, the parents are starting to believe that something otherworldly may be at play, so they discreetly ask their neighbors if they've ever experienced any disturbances, which they hadn't. Meanwhile, back at the house, with no adults to stand in their way, the malevolent forces make their move, with the tree attacking Robbie and a portal opening to suck Carol Ann into its depths. The parents arrive back home just in time to save Robbie from being swallowed alive by the goddamn tree, but with all the chaos going on both inside and outside the house, they were too late to reach Carol Ann. But she was now communicating with them from the realm of the spirits through the television set, saying that she's lost and can't find her way back. The next morning, the family enlists the services of Dr. Marcia Lesh, a parapsychologist, and her team members, Marty and Ryan. After some investigating, they come to the conclusion that the house is plagued by a poltergeist intrusion involving multiple ghosts. Meanwhile, Steve finds out from his boss that the entire housing development of Cuesta Verde was once a cemetery, and that the bodies and gravestones were relocated before they started any construction on the homes. Now, before we go any further, I'd like to address 2 very big mistakes on my part. First, during the review of the 2015 remake last week, I stated that the realm Carol Ann gets stuck in is called the Further. That was an idiot move on my part. As I was trying to decide which film series to review for Halloween this year, I watched a bunch of horror titles consecutively back to back, and by recommendation of my best friend, I watched all 4 Insidious films before I settled on reviewing Poltergeist. So my dumbass mixed up the details, calling the Poltergeist realm the Further. I apologize for that. The second issue was, in that same review, I was critical to the remake for not mentioning the ancient tribal burial ground with more significance, instead just talking about it in passing instead of detailing its later significance. But in reality, the original did the same thing, so I apologize for those major oversights. The spirits start to mess with everyone's minds, making Marty think that his face is peeling away into raw flesh, and that the stakes are infested with maggots. They're eventually able to see some sort of spiritual entity projecting down the stairway. So the next morning, Steve and Diane send Robbie to stay at a friend's house out of precaution. Everyone collectively decides that they need to call in the big guns, and thus we're introduced to ultra-clairvoyant psychic Tangina Barons, who is more than willing to lend her services to assist the Freelings. She explains that the spirits are not malevolent per se, but are souls that haven't realized they passed on and thus are trapped between the realm of the living and the dead. Now there's one particular spirit, known as the Beast, that wants to use Carol Ann's innocence to trap more souls as they're passing through the afterlife. In this film, he's referred to, as I said, the Beast. In the following films, he is referred to as Kane, or Reverend Henry Kane. But we'll get to that next week. They're eventually able to reach out to Carol Ann, and the mother goes through the portal to try and bring her home. With Tangina's guidance from this side, the two of them return home safely, and Tangina declares the house as clean. Not taking any chances, they decide to move away, and we see the family finally at ease as they start to pack up a moving truck, planning to stay the night at a Holiday Inn until they can get everything packed up the next day. The pacing of the narrative is done perfectly here. The characters, as well as the audience, are finally at ease, and just when you least expect it, we're back for round goddamn 2. Turns out that Tangina was mistaken as fuck about the house being clean, and this time the Beast and the other spirits are going 10 times harder than before. Everyone in the house is simultaneously attacked. The practical effects, like when the mom is kinetically dragged all up and down the wall and ceiling of her room, still hold up very well. Portals open, inanimate objects attack, and the entire foundation of the house comes apart, with the corpses of the deceased shooting furiously out of the ground from all directions. Fun fact, they actually used real-life skeletons in this section of the film. Nothing here was curated. These are actual real-life skeletons of real-life people that passed on. That's fucking crazy. That would never happen today under any circumstances. While all this is going on, Steve arrives home to all this chaos, and a few minutes later, the eldest daughter does as well. And her horrified reaction is just fucking hilarious. She didn't have much to do in this film, so it's notable whenever she is in the scene. The realtor shows up, and Steve confronts him about having only moved the headstones, but not the bodies. And you can really feel the distress and frustration and anger as he screams at the realtor so aggressively that it devolves into a high-pitched shriek of despair. Shout out to JoBeth Williams. She really got down and dirty in this film more than anyone else. The scene where she's trying to escape from the collapsing pool in layers and layers of mud and water and rain, and in such close proximity to all those real-life skeletons, fuck that shit. That is some goddamn dedication to the craft, let me tell you. The entire family manages to get to the car, as the tension is high, with Steve struggling to start the car engine before they're wiped out by the spirits. They manage to start the car and barely escape before the entire house implodes. The last scene we see of the family is them exhaustingly entering a room at the Holiday Inn, with Steve putting the television set outside out of precaution. They close the door, and Carol Ann's theme creeps in once again as the camera slowly zooms out into a long shot of the credits. And if you listen to the theme all the way to the end of the credits, you'll hear a loud, sinister cackle of dead children as the score fades. Fucking scary. So, how does this film hold up 41 years after its initial release? Pretty damn well, if you ask me. Now, obviously, after watching it multiple times by this point, it's not nearly as terrifying as the first time I saw it, but nevertheless, it definitely does its job. When it's supposed to be creepy, it's fucking creepy. And when it's supposed to be quiet, contemplative, and somber, it's quiet, contemplative, and somber. With an outstanding cast and crew in front of and behind the camera, everyone really brought their A-game to this film, and that effort can be felt on every viewing. If you haven't seen it before, I highly suggest you give it a watch this Halloween season. And if you have seen it before, then you already know how good of a film this is. I'd like to take this time to thank my editor. None of this would be possible without all of your hard work, so thank you. And to everyone watching, I sincerely thank you for your time, and I hope you'll join me next week as we review the sequel, 1986's Poltergeist 2, The Other Side. Thank you again, everyone. Stay safe this Halloween season, and take care.